gives me great honor and a privilege to introduce Bo Persson from Sweden. Here we're at the Cinematheque in Jerusalem. Really, thank you so much for giving your valuable time this evening.
Thank you.
It's a real honor and a privilege to meet with you.
Thank you.
We saw your movie, the iconic movie that you made, Watching the Moon at Night, at the Cinematheque in November.
Yes.
With very good reviews.
Thank you.
So before we go into what inspired you to make such an amazing movie, it was actually, that movie was financed by the Swedish television, but they refused to film it, to air it. Can we just get a bit of a background, where you were born and what made you interested in film? Just a little bit of a history of where you come from and what inspired you into filmmaking.
Yes. I was born on the Swedish west coast in Göteborg, and as a very young man, at the age of 17, I spent 1 year in America, and I was inspired by a lot of good theater productions in New York. So a few years later, my focus was to go into theater.
And as a child, growing up, you were always keen on theater?
Yes, and to write and to direct theater. But eventually, to make a long story short, years later, in the 80s, I started to make films for Swedish television, and I went on many trips to Poland at the time. It was a rough time in the 1980s in Poland.
And Solidarity?
Solidarity was in 80, 81, and then it was crushed by the military coup in December 1981. And I was very close with a theater group, experimental theater group in Poland, called the Teatro Megonia, or 8-day theater. And so actually my first feature-length documentary, which I made with my friend Joanna Helander, was a kind of a road movie about these actors who were working underground during communism, in exile and coming back to Poland at the time of the Democratic Revolution in 89.
And wasn't it dangerous making such a movie of the Polish authorities?
Well, it could be uncomfortable and unpleasant at times, but there was never any danger really during these years to be tortured if you were arrested or killed. But it was difficult to make films in Poland during those years because you had to smuggle film into Poland and smuggle the filmed material out of Poland. But of course, all this changed after '89, when Poland became a much more open society, and censorship collapsed. And so I've been going back and forth to Poland, and the last movie before this one was a film about a Polish poet, Nobel Prize winner called Czesław Miłosz, who has been also translated a lot to Hebrew. He spent 40 years in America during communism. He was one of the first so-called dissidents from the Eastern Bloc. But after the democratization of Poland, he returned to his native country and settled in Krakow for the last 10 years of his life, and we became friends, and I was happy to make a film with him about his life and his poetry.
And was that really well received in Poland?
Yes, it was very well received there, and so I'm still showing that film in different parts of the world also. It's called Waltz with Miłosz. It's called Waltz because it's inspired by a poem he wrote called Waltz, which he wrote in Nazi-occupied Warsaw in 1942. And Miłosz was not only a Nobel Prize winner, but he was also a righteous Gentile, because he and his brother were protecting and rescuing Jews in Warsaw. So I was doing some research also here in Yad Vashem about
And
about
he's
this
known
time.
as, in Hebrew it's called Chasidei Matan,
Yes,
one of the righteous of the
absolutely,
Gentiles.
both he and his brother. But they never talked, much about it because for them it was obvious.
It was something natural.
It was something natural, obvious that he didn't speak about. But he was a great poet, and so eventually this film, Watching the Moon at Night, was in the making for many years. And one of the inspirations for this film is my friendship and with Professor Walter Lacour, who is now 96 and is still active and writing in Washington, but who came here to Israel or to Palestine in November 1938 as a 17-year-old boy. And then he spent many years here and eventually ended up in Washington, and he has written 30, 40 books and many on terrorism and anti-Semitism. So during our conversations over the years,
That gained your interest in the topic.
we talked a lot about these issues. First I wanted to make a film with him about another book he wrote called Watching the Moon. Shall we interrupt because of this? Yeah, we can make it cut later because it's kind of too much. Okay. Okay, so we continue and then you can just intersect with something from... So first I wanted to make another movie with Walter Lacour, inspired by a book he wrote called The Terrible Secrets. Terrible Secrets, he referred to how the information of the Holocaust traveled from Nazi-occupied Poland to the West in 1941, 1942, and how this messages, how this truth was suppressed by also by the Allied governments. It took until November 1942 until the British government and Roosevelt openly spoke about this.
There were also very prominent American papers that refused to publish.
They put it on the 25th page.
That's right.
And so
It's a very dark period because there was self-censorship.
Yes,
And if people would have known, it would have been very different.
I think so.
History would have been different. But you're right. He wrote...
He wrote this kind of classic book about this, on the lack of imagination. It wasn't, the truth about the Holocaust was not only suppressed because of anti-Semitism, it was also suppressed because people's lack of imagination. To understand that something of that scale and that cruelty could happen in the heart of Europe. It's... and many people, of course, were also kind of governed by wishful thinking, hoping that maybe it's bad, but not as bad as the news convey. So even in 1944, when it was technically possible for the Western Allies to bomb the tracks to Auschwitz, it wasn't even tried. It wasn't even tried, and so that's. So then, instead of making that film with him, because I couldn't find a sponsor for that film, some years later we embarked on what became Watching the Moon at Night, and so I wanted to address, these two issues: terrorism, contemporary terrorism, and contemporary anti-Semitism. And of course these are separate in a way, but they also work together sometimes. And of course not always, but for instance in my film we have the case of the attack on the Israeli athletes in Munich 1972. And Dan Alon, the Israeli athlete, is testifying for how he miraculously survived when his fellow athletes were slaughtered.
It was difficult because watching that, I remember seeing that movie, he had feelings that maybe he could have helped and he ran away to save. It's a very difficult, he was in a very difficult position.
Yeah.
But you bring it out very well in that movie.
it was important for Dan, who, by the way, passed away last week, to talk about his trauma, because it was a trauma which remained with him throughout his life.
It's true, and it wasn't well publicized. You know, you hear Munich and you hear the massacre, you don't really hear about
Those who survived.
survived.
Yes. And so he became one of the people I reached out to in order to testify in the film. And I wanted to include victims of terrorism, Jewish, Christian and Muslims, and to give a platform for them to address these issues. Parallel to have, of course, some historians and scholars, one psychoanalyst, commenting on these issues.
I think the combination of bringing in both Christian, Muslim and Jewish victims, it's very important, and you did it exceptionally well. It came across amazingly well in your documentary.
Thank you.
Can I just ask, how did you get involved with Swedish television? Did they approach you, or?
Well, actually, the film was produced by my and Johanna Helander's small company, with the financial support primarily from the Swedish Film Institute. And then both our company and the Swedish Film Institute wanted Swedish TV to be co-producer in order to be able to have a chance to have a wider audience.
A wider audience.
Yes.
You can see such an important...
Because documentaries find their audiences mostly on TV. And I've been working with the Swedish public TV with other films, and so it was natural to turn to them. And there was a certain skepticism from the beginning, but finally they agreed to co-produce and co-finance the film. However, when the film was ready, to our surprise, they refused to screen it, and they still refuse to this day. But many of the most prominent journalists in Sweden was writing about this and defending the film against the Swedish public TV. In this case, it's actually public TV who is breaking their own rules, not to screen the film.
Because if they would screen it, they could give a platform for people to debate such an important issue, which is so very topical, unfortunately, with terrorism all over Europe.
Of course.
But by self-censorship, it reflects very badly on Swedish television in a way. It really does. It's denying the people the opportunity to see something that you worked so hard for, and you incorporate. It's not only focused on one religion or one sector. You embrace everything. And what do you think the chances are that they will screen it one day?
It's hard to say, but I'm certainly not going to be silenced by them. So Johanna and me, with the support of many journalists in Sweden, and prominent members from the cultural life of Sweden, including from the Swedish Nobel Committee, we are urging Swedish television to lift this ban, and I think it's a 50-50 chance that we will succeed. Now, there is a somewhat parallel case in Germany last year, when German public TV asked two filmmakers to make a film about anti-Semitism in Europe. And when the film was ready, German TV was not prepared to show the film. They censored the film. And it was a strong uproar in Germany, also because of the specific history of Germany and anti-Semitism. And finally, the public TV was backing down, and they did screen the film. And I hope the same thing will happen in Sweden with this film. But it's been getting around. It was shown in 15 countries by now, I think. And
you had very good reviews. I know here when it was shown at the Cinematheque here in Jerusalem, you had exceptionally good reviews.
Yes,
It was well attended.
Yes.
I was very fortunate to be in the audience and to watch it. But I remember reading the reviews, which was very, very positive.
Very. And the same is true, you know.
Where else has it been shown? Where have you heard it?
We had a pre-premiere in the Swedish Parliament, and then it was shown also after it was ready in the European Parliament. It was some members of the European Parliament who invited the film. And it was followed by a Q&A and discussion in the European Parliament. Then it was shown in New York and Washington, in New York at the Center for Jewish History, and by the way, it's going to be shown again now in New York in April in the JCC, the Jewish Community Center in Manhattan. And it was shown in Paris, it was shown in Warsaw, it was shown in Nice, it was shown in London. It's going to be shown in the next few days in the Danish Film Institute in Copenhagen.
It's wonderful.
So it's getting around, you know.
And at all these airings, you're there?
Not always, but it's very...
Is there discussion on the movie afterwards?
On many occasions, yes. And it's very interesting because, you know, the film itself can also function as a kind of starter for a discussion of what is happening in that particular country, in that particular moment.
Yeah.
Like in Paris, of course, the discussion after the film was also a lot about what was happening in Paris over the last few years.
Unfortunately, been a lot of terror attacks. And,
Charlie Hebdo, Bataclan, the Hypercaché, and so on.
But it's affected the whole of the French society. It hasn't been, it's been specific for different, it's affected the Jewish community, but it's also affected the Christian and the Muslim community as well. So it's, unfortunately, it's a universal threat that we face today.
Absolutely, and I think European politicians, so it seems to me, are not really prepared to tackle this. You know, there is a certain, what should I say, unwillingness to analyze the roots of contemporary terrorism. And it's a certain unwillingness to analyze the connections between terrorist groups and major big powers like Iran. You know, it's at the same time as America and Europe and so forth has this new agreement with Iran, it seems to me they have difficulties to analyze that Iran is a world sponsor of terrorism at the same time. And a lot of this money which are now being released and have been sent back to Iran,
it's going
to the enemies of Israel and is, you know, part of what we saw these last days, you know, that Iran-sponsored groups attack Israel. And so it's a lot of hypocrisy.
Do you feel people want to be more politically correct, and that's why they don't want to really approach the problem in its reality?
Yes. There is a kind of, they are sleepwalking. I mean, sometimes it's a lack of courage, sometimes it's a lack of knowledge, and frequently a lack of both. And, you know, for instance, in my country, Sweden, it's also an issue because many terrorists who have been involved in attacks outside Sweden the last few years, like the mastermind of Bataclan, he was living in Sweden for many years. So Sweden being a society which, in a way, of course, unwillingly, but still, nevertheless, export terrorism to other European countries. And it's only now, you know, after this has been going on for years, that journalists start to write about it. But this is, of course, very serious.
It's extremely serious, it's true.
And I don't know what we should think about the future, you know, because like Walter Lacour always stressed when it came to the Holocaust and other issues, that people are so inclined for wishful thinking. And it's a fear of confronting the naked truth in life and in politics. And so politicians escape into rosy ideologies and instead of looking at the hard facts which they have to deal with. And
I think there's, if I can just mention, in your documentary, there's an interview with a lady who remembers that they were rounded up in Paris.
yes,
And she turned around and said, "What are we doing here?" And she made a fuss. She said, "I don't want to be here. Where are we going? Where are you taking us?" And they let her go because they didn't
Right.
want to cause a major upheaval.
yeah,
So by letting her go and her family, it saved her. By her speaking out against what was happening to her, which she didn't want to be a part of,
right,
because she didn't remain silent, it saved her and her family's life.
exactly. That was
So I think that was a very, very powerful moment in that movie.
right.
Somebody who did something, instead of just going quietly and just accepting and hoping for the best, they realized that this is not a normal situation and I'm not going to just follow and become part of it. And she made a noise, and that actually saved their lives.
Exactly.
I think that was a very powerful part of that
It
movie.
was the mother of Les Glassman.
Yeah, it was
the-
incredible. And look, it saved
Yeah.
him, it saved her.
Yeah, yeah. I think this is. It's unfortunately André Glucksmann, who is in the film and who tells the story about his mother, is no longer with us. He passed away, and actually his funeral was the same day as the Bataclan massacre in Paris.
Amazing.
So people went from his funeral, to the, and then there was bloody massacres in Paris.
But that's what makes your documentary even more important for people to watch. Because you've got people who saw the reality and who speak about it, and world authorities on the subject. People should be begging to watch it. It should be, it is so superbly done.
And I was, privileged to work with a very good team, because as you know, making films is kind of teamwork. You have cameramen, you have sound technicians, you have film editors, you have people who do the mixing, the color grading, what have you. And it took also some time just to gather the right people, that people are more or less on the same wavelength and on the same professional level.
And Bo, not only that, you mentioned to me earlier on the name of your movie.
Yeah.
What inspired you with the name?
Yeah, no, that's, I'm very honored that Wisława Szymborska, who was the great poet in Krakow, who got the Nobel Prize in 1996.
You've got a close connection.
Yes, we both Johanna and me knew her quite well in Krakow, and she said how could she contribute to the film, and so she contributed with 3 of her poems, and 2 poems she reads herself in Polish, and the third one is read by a Swedish actor. And the first poem, which opens the film, actually the English title of the poem would be something like Watching the Moon at Night. It's about what the terrorists do during the night
when they're not active,
as they are preparing to commit a crime on the following morning. And so it's great that that she was somebody I very much appreciate. Is part of the film in this way, and also, of course, when people see a film in a cinematheque or in a movie theater, they don't always think who was editing the film, and the editors are never mentioned in the reviews of a film.
It's true. It's always the director and the movie stars. It's true.
But every filmmaker knows that without
it's a team effort.
Without a good film editor or a couple of good film editors, it's very difficult to make a good film.
Your film, I think, stands out not only in the editing and the way that you put it together, the people that you have in the movie itself.
Yeah.
I mean, one was Arnold Roth, whose daughter unfortunately was in the Subaru massacre. The same, her daughter, I have a connection. His daughter and my daughter were in the same class, the same school in Korea. But he speaks so openly, and it's just raw emotion. You have somebody who lost a daughter, who went through such a trauma, him and his wife and their family, and you tell it like it is. So it's so important for anyone who wants to approach this topic or even try to learn about the topic. Here you've done something quite unique. You've interviewed amazing people from the broad spectrum. You had a Muslim lady who spoke
from
about
Algeria.
the terrible things, the atrocities that were happening in Algeria.
Which people don't know so much about.
And there were terrible atrocities.
200,000 people were killed in the mid-1990s in Algeria.
It's not really known.
And like she says in the movie, had the world paid attention to the Islamic terror in Algeria in the 1990s, they would not have been so surprised with 9/11.
She tells her own personal story, which is horrendous, but it was a wake-up call. It still is a wake-up call.
Yeah.
So the more people that see it can be more prepared. I mean, you have given an opportunity for Europe to basically wake up, to see. They say you must smell the coffee. You've given them such a realistic interview with people that have experienced and the lessons that they've learned. And unfortunately, people don't want to hear the truth or see the reality. But please God, it will change. And I think the more people that get to see the movie, the more people that hear about it will try to influence others. And I think you must just continue showing it at as many venues as possible. And then possibly making it public to go that it can be shown at even more venues.
Yes.
And more institutions and more places.
It's so disturbing, I think, that the mainstream media in Europe and probably beyond Europe, in America and elsewhere, when there is a terrorist attack, they focus on the terrorists when they write about it. When Bin Laden was living in Afghanistan and released a new video, it was on prime time on American TV.
That's true.
But what about the victims? I mean, the victims are somehow less important to the mainstream media. And that's why I made the decision not to have any terrorists in the film. Only have victims and scholars. And to make a statement about that. And I think this is something which the politicians of Europe should really learn to give platforms for the victims of terror, because it's listening to the individual stories of terror victims from Spain or France or London. It's a very important arm in the counter-terrorist strategy also. It's underestimated in our how to say a tool among our tools to defeat terrorism, to have the victims have a platform in public, and to make people feel in their guts what this is all about. And I'm surprised that this is not happening to a larger extent.
It's very true, coming here from Jerusalem, living in Jerusalem and having gone through the suicide bombings on the buses and everything, and there were also not only Jewish victims, there were also Muslim victims. Terrorism doesn't discriminate who one kills, but the victims are often forgotten. And they have to get on with their lives, and you don't realize the impact. I've got patients who fathers or people were on these buses and they were killed. And you see the devastation, what happens with the family, and how it affects the family, not for one day, but forever.
Of course.
And I think in your movie, you've actually shown something that is very unique. That shouldn't be unique. It should be in the public domain. Everybody should be discussing it. But it's true. When you see primetime television, it's always the perpetrators.
Yeah.
So, Bo, it's amazing. It really is. You worked incredible. It was a very, very special documentary that you made. What is your next project? Have you thought of a...
Oh, yes. As a documentary filmmaker, you have to have several projects kind of in the pipeline. And if you're lucky, you will be able to find some finance to make at least one of them. Yes?
Well, to any listener out there, this is somebody that I really recommend to finance and to be in touch with. So if you could give us just a bit of a...
Yes, I'm working on a project now with a woman who survived Birkenau, and she's now living in Washington. And she came with her family being deported by the Nazis from Hungary. She came in May 1944 to Birkenau. And she was lucky to survive, but most of her family perished. And she happened to arrive to Birkenau the very day and the very hour when some two SS men were making black and white photos of the arriving deportees. It didn't happen before, it didn't happen after. So there were about 250 or so black and white photos made that day in Birkenau. And it's unclear why these photos were made. And Irene, this is her name, she is in one of the iconic photos from that collection, when she's standing on the platform, just having been separated from her family. And her little brothers are also in photos there, and her mother. And so we were filming together in Birkenau when she returned, quote unquote, to Birkenau to tell the story to her children and grandchildren.
Was this the first time that she'd been back?
She had been back once, but not with her family.
And here she was relating her experiences to her family?
Yeah.
And you were there filming?
Yeah, we were. Irene's daughter is a good friend of mine, and so she called and said, my mother decided we should, or asked us to go with her to Birkenau. Wouldn't you like to come along and document it? So we, in the beginning, I thought maybe this will be like for the family archive, but I think the Irene, this woman, is so strong, and the visual material is so strong from that visit to Birkenau that it makes sense to make it into a public film. And the story of these photographs are also...
And that was the one day?
The one day, the 1 hour, the 1 minute.
So you basically documented history?
Well, I would like to finish that film with Irene, and also the story of how these photos, survived, which is also a fascinating story, because another survivor from Auschwitz-Birkenau, when she was liberated in the spring of 1945 by the Americans, I think it was, she woke up from a kind of coma of being a prisoner and being starved and having nothing. And in the barrack where she woke up, she opened a closet or something. And in that closet she found an album, like a photographic album. But however, the photos which were in the album were from Birkenau, including members of her extended family. And she was shocked, and it was her only possession. She took this album with her back to the little town in Hungary, now Ukraine, where she grew up.
This is the only evidence of her family that remained.
And she eventually took this album with her to Budapest and eventually to America. And her husband died, she remarried, she had a new name. She was working in a restaurant in Florida, but nobody knew, or few people, no historian knew where she was with the album until Serge Klarsfeld, the French lawyer, said he would like to find this album. So Serge Klarsfeld, together with Peter Hellman, a journalist in New York, they hired a private detective, and eventually they found Lily, as she was called, down in Miami Beach, and they went knocking on her door in 1979, and eventually they could convince her that she would show them her album, and also that she would donate the album to Yad Vashem. So that's where it is now. So this will be, I would like to have this a second part of so one part would be the Irene story from Birkenau, and then the story of the photos, either as one film or two separate films. So that's what I'm working on now. But I'm also, thinking of making maybe some additions to this film, Watching the Moon at Night, which we were talking about, because obviously things are happening non-stop all over the place. And even though I think that Watching the Moon at Night is a kind of timeless movie in the sense that it deals with some universal questions also, which goes beyond the news of the day, so to speak. But I'm contemplating maybe to make some addition, a postscriptum to the film, maybe, with some of the latest events from the last year or so. This is what I'm contemplating also to do.
Well, Bar, I must just mention that your project for the future with the Birkenau and with the photographs, when you hear so much of Holocaust denial,
yes,
and people saying it didn't really happen, and the deniers, I mean, you are doing a phenomenally important. It's not only a documentary, but you are showing the history, the true history, what happened. It's so important that you continue with your work, and that it's shown, and that people can see exactly what you're doing, and actually see history in the making. I mean, you are retelling the facts which actually happened. It's so very important.
It's very troubling. I mean, what is happening in Europe today. I mean, it's.
You're having with Poland just the last week, saying
it's beyond
rewriting history and
beyond belief.
It is beyond belief, but I think your documentaries will show the truth, and the truth is there, and you have the incredible talent. Not only talent, you have the gift to portray the truth, and I just think you must continue in your amazing and vital work.
It's so disconcerting what is happening in Poland now. This is in a few weeks, or in March of now we are 2018. There will be the 50th anniversary of the anti-Semitic campaign of 1968. When many Jews in Poland who had stayed there lost their jobs and basically were kicked out of the country. So it's difficult to grasp the timing of the Polish government with this ridiculous new legislation. To present it as a proposal to the Parliament and the Senate and the President on this very month of the 50th anniversary of a biggest anti-Semitic campaign in Europe since the war.
The other terribly worrying thing is that people are saying it might just start with Poland, but then the Ukraine and
it already happened in Ukraine,
and it can start spreading to all the countries, and then the deniers will say, well, it didn't really happen, and prove it. And
from what I understand, it already happened before before this new events in Poland, the last now in January 2018. It already happened before in Ukraine and in Lithuania in many ways. I understand from people living there whom I'm in touch with. But the world community didn't react in the same strong way as it's now reacting vis-à-vis the Polish government. So I think it's, other countries in this part of Europe got away with these things already, and the world was not on its toes. Had the world again not been sleepwalking and had been, debating what was happening in Lithuania and Ukraine with some issues similar to what is happening in Poland, it would have been much difficult for the Polish government to go ahead with this. The world is too reacting too late always, and this is very sad and very tragic. And we have to be proactive, and it's.
Well, I think you are an example of somebody who is extremely proactive, because you are doing something that has not really been done, and you are showing that it is by the work and the documentaries that you do. You are being very, very proud. And we just encourage you, and I can't thank you enough for your giving us this valuable time of yours, and we wish you just all the very, very best. May you be, there's a word, you should just be successful and continue in your endeavors with tremendous success and support. And everybody out there, we really urge you to support Bo for his amazing work that he does.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.